The number of journalists jailed around the world has reached a record-breaking figure. A report by the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ, found that 363 reporters were deprived of their freedom as at December 1st, 2022, a new global high that overtakes last year's record by 20%. The report shows that at least 56 journalists were jailed in Africa in 2022, and Egypt was the top jailer country. This year's top 5 jailers of journalists are Iran, China, Myanmar, Turkey, and Belarus. Imprisoning journalists is just one measure of how authoritarian leaders try to strangle press freedom. It says the government hide under the guise of waging war against fake news and cybercrime allegations to hound journalists and jail them. The report records that one journalist was imprisoned in Nigeria, while no journalist lost their life under such circumstance in the country. Okay, joining us now to discuss the report on the assault of journalists is senior researcher with the Committee to Protect Journalists, Jonathan Rozen, who joins us from New York via Zoom, and human rights lawyer and Arise News analyst, Frank Tietie. Gentlemen, very warm welcome to Newsnight. Let's start with you, Jonathan, in New York. Your organization carried out this research. You want to tell us where the samples were drawn from and how you arrived at your conclusions?
Thank you for having me. The Committee to Protect Journalists conducts research leading up to the census date for our annual prison census, which is December 1st. And we look through every single country to make sure that we are aware of and documenting journalists being detained in connection with their work. We have correspondents and researchers around the world who follow developments on press freedom globally, keep track of journalists when they are arrested, and then write profiles that are published in the census every year in December.
All right, okay, let's speak to Arise analyst Tietie, who is here with me in the studio. Very alarming report there. 363 jailed or are still in jail. Only one in Nigeria. Frank, we touched from one journalist in Cross River State to the one in Kaduna State who were detained. One was, had his head shaved, by the governor, agents of the governor. Is that accurate record about the situation in Nigeria?
Well, I think that the global situation, it's actually very worrisome. However, I think because of concerted efforts on the part of civil society and transparent reporting, and with the figures that we get from time to time from what the CPJ has done, for example, all of that have led to the improvement of the Nigerian situation. Yes, it is increasingly tough to be a journalist, to practice true journalism in Nigeria. We see what's going on with regards to these political times, unnecessarily vilifying Arise News, when, as a matter of fact, Arise News has been, to me, the fairest in terms of political coverage and giving opportunities to all the candidates to actually appear absolutely free of charge, to the best of my knowledge. And as a privileged Arise News analyst, I've had times on this platform to defend some of Bola Ahmed Tinubu's position, especially when he came out from Chatham House. And then all of that to be seen to be interpreted as being against a particular political party shows you how much it is, how people want to demonize any media house, more especially if they cannot take any control or if they cannot, bend it or sway it in the way they want. So it's increasingly very difficult to practice, pure journalism, either as a freelance journalist or as a media house, whether it's state actors trying to maul the media, or you find non-state actors, politicians, also doing everything possible to attack media reputation. This reflects kind of the difficulty that journalists go through.
Yeah, quite hazardous job, as some would want to call it. But let me come to you again, Jonathan. Jonathan, when you look at the figures, 363, and you underscore it against the top countries in the world where the top jailers in the world, Iran, Myanmar, and others. Are you surprised that such countries, are the top jailers? Is it because of their attitudes to democratic cultures, intolerance rather, and hiding under the issues of fake news and cyber crimes?
Well, certainly the top jailers annually have remained relatively consistent, but really this year is unique in a number of ways. Obviously, the number of journalists in jail is a record high, and that's up by 20% since last year. But also the top jailer, Iran, is a new top jailer for us in recent years. And that's really due to the crackdown on the protests, the women-led protests that we've seen there recently, journalists being arrested in connection with coverage. And we see at least 22 women journalists arrested since the protests began. Also, Myanmar was catapulted to the top of the census last year following the coup in February. And so those two countries, along with China, are the top three jailers. But of course, there's also African countries in the top 10. We have Egypt with 21 journalists. That's down from the number following some releases that took place under international pressure, and Eritrea with 16 journalists behind bars. And many of them have been there for over 20 years now, since the crackdown in 2001.
That's quite alarming. The African continent and some of those African countries, of course, just have what you may call quasi-democratic culture. Let me bring in a RISE analyst here in the studio, Frank. Frank, what kind of support, the journalists, particularly here in Nigeria, only one was mentioned, but are they getting enough support, either from the journalist union or the proprietors association and the rest for such annihilation?
No, not quite. The NUJ oftentimes is helpless whenever a journalist is assaulted or detained unjustly, as we've had it. But one good thing is that the NUJ always responds. For those of us who work with civil society leaders, we are quick to often inform the committee to protect journalists. And the committee, the CPJ, what it does is that it often engages with the situation. It engages even with the state actors who oftentimes perpetrate these acts of oppression against journalists. We have had an improved situation in our country, despite the fact that we have very oppressive laws against journalists, particularly the Cyber Crimes Act, which can actually provide a ground to arrest and detain a journalist simply for making a comment that is interpreted to be an insult to anybody in a political office or any person in authority. As the laws are there to actually deal with journalists in a very rough manner. However, in the build-up to this election, we haven't actually seen that kind of atmosphere of oppression. Thanks to the work of the CPJ in its campaign and in its inquiries that it has made to government officials, and the call by civil society for press freedom. And then you notice one thing very clear, is that countries that actually allow press freedom seem to be more stable, more politically stable, and economically prosperous.
Yes, the economic prosperity, even of the journalists, very paramount. Lastly, let me come to you again, Jonathan, and tell us, how is the CPJ really helping, to assuage the pains, the dangers, journalists worldwide face?
That's a very important question, and really CPJ operates with three pillars. The first is the research, and today's release of the prison census is a great example of the documentation that we do all year. Press freedom violations, of arrests of journalists, of laws that inhibit the press, of the killings of journalists, and it calls for accountability for authorities to either hold those responsible to account or to release journalists. This is the kind of advocacy that builds on the research that we do when we engage directly with governments and other centers of power, calling for the reforms that will improve the conditions for journalists around the world. But we also do emergency assistance, delivering assistance to journalists when they're in their most dire need, and ensuring that they have the information that they need to operate safely through safety advisories and other safety information that's available on our website.
That's very kind and thoughtful of the CPJ, and we want to thank you to Jonathan Rozen, is a researcher with the CPJ, coming out with his latest global figure of 363 journalists in incarceration. He joined us from New York. Thanks, Jonathan, and Arise News analyst and human rights lawyer Frank Tietie. Thanks for coming on Newsnight.